Okay, hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of western North Carolina. And I'm here with Scott Davalos today. Scotty's up in Marin County. Hey, Scotty.
Hi, good morning.
There you are. Yeah.
Yeah,
So Scotty and I were talking yesterday. If you watch on the news, you get the impression that every single street corner in San Francisco is riddled with homeless and just needles and just a mess. But Scotty, yesterday you were telling me that you guys went into San Francisco from Marin County the other day, and you didn't. I mean, you just didn't go to the bad areas, but your whole experience was fine, right?
that would no, it's completely fine.
Hmm.
Um, the In fact, we went through the bad areas too, because you
Oh,
have
really?
the city. I don't know if
What
people
was it like
realize how
going through
small.
them?
Yeah, San Francisco is super small. So,
I'm having a hard
you
time
know,
hearing you, Scotty.
I said San Francisco is super small.
Yeah.
It's not a giant city. So
Well,
we
it's
were
not
driving all over
L.A.
the place. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like anything else. You if you're on one block where the whole thing's coming apart and you're on TV filming that spot, it looks like the whole world's coming apart. That's what
Yeah,
it felt
that's
like to
right.
me.
It sure did.
You know,
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I think that's interesting. All right. Well, today, this is an interesting topic. There's this one fitness trainer on YouTube. His name's Jeff Cavalier. He's Athlean X. If you just type in Athlean X, you'll see him. And he really mostly targets, young guys that are bodybuilding, who are lifting weights, athletic oriented. Uh, but he's really good. He's a physical therapist, and so he weaves all that together. And he says some really good things. He said a nice quote here. He said, uh, actually, this was in a podcast he did about deadlifting, if you know what deadlifting is. Uh, and he said, the foundation of strength is always stability. And so he talked about how in that particular exercise, or all exercises, but he was focusing on that one, how to really maintain stability throughout the exercise. And it's a great quote. I mean, it made me think of I don't know who came up with the quote originally, but if you could understand one grain of salt, if you could know but one grain of sand, I think it was, then you would understand the whole universe. And that's the principle of mapping. Everything maps onto everything else. And gee, if you really got a handle on the principle of mapping, kind of like in Siddhartha, the book by Hermann Hesse, he supposedly got enlightened by watching the water flow down a river. Well, those principles map onto everything in the universe. Everything maps. Some of the mappings are pretty complex, and there's a lot in the Vedic tradition that addresses some of these mappings. And well, by virtue of that, some of these mappings are so abstract that it just seems to a kind of a linear thinking orientation of how Westerners have really been indoctrinated. It's like that's just too far out. So a lot of the different things that are done on a daily basis or ceremonially or whatever, they're based on these profound and deep mappings. So for example, doing pradakshina, when you go into the temple and you go around the central shrine several times, that sort of a thing. It's like, how can that work? But it's because mappings are complex. There's also, well, this all gets very interesting, but there's also this principle of omens, even. And on one level, from a Western perspective, omens don't make any sense, do they? But at the same time, for most people, there's an intuitive gut feeling that something, is a bad sign, so to speak. Um, and so superstition can really creep into principles like that. And so it's really hard to sort out what's a valid mapping application and what's just superstition. but nevertheless, it's there. The knowledge is there, and the principle is valid. So, at any rate, this quote of Jeff Cavalier's, "The foundation of strength is always stability," is a beautiful quote, and it applies to everything. It's universal principle, and it applies in different ways, just as mappings do. Uh, uh, so, even just when it comes to our individual life, I was addressing I like to address school kids. It's a lot of fun to get a group of young kids in there and talk to them. And it's beautiful. I mean, they respond beautifully, really, to the principles that we share. And I remember at one point, just to summarize at the end of the thing, I was talking about how, the future really is bright, and we have principles, we have technologies, we have knowledge. And it's just a matter of applying that knowledge we already have could transform the world. And I said that you kids are going to be the ones that really bring that forth. Technological breakthroughs have transformed the world many times, and there are others that are just around the corner. But when I said, okay, you kids, we're going to be the ones, I remember there's this one kid in the audience that just kind of felt that as a burden. And so I addressed that. I said, no. I said, it's not a burden. I said, it's just, if we just live life in accord with just who we are, we'll find our way. And we will, those of us who are just naturally inclined in the direction of becoming scientists will do that. Artists will do that. And the only thing then you really have to do is live your life. And I said, and keep your nose clean. And they liked it, And so what is that about? Living your life and keeping your nose clean? Well, really, it's about stability. The place we get in trouble in life is we lose our stable foundation. If we can just keep the stability and a cultural integrity, a healthy culture, a healthy upbringing, that sort of thing, it enlivens that within us. But the main stability is inner stability. But through that inner stability, then we radiate stability to the whole environment. If the minds are stable, if the health is stable, internationally, things become stable. There was an interesting thing that an attorney I know said. And he said, this isn't a good thing for an attorney to say. But he said, seems to me, he said that a lot of people are smart and a lot of people are crazy. And he said, and the thing is that even among the smart people, most of them are crazy, and that sounds like a horrible statement. But if you just look at world affairs, a lot of these leaders of the countries, these guys are smart, but there's a little something crazy about them. But now it's an interesting thing because not just this Jeff Cavalier fitness trainer, but also in the Vedic knowledge, the Ancient Seers, the Rishis, understood this principle of stability and how it is essential to strength. If you're stable in your base, then you're strong. But strength, attempting at strength without having inner stability, it will crumble. And it's very interesting to see how the KGB. There's a video, very interesting video. You can look it up on YouTube. It's a KGB agent that defected in 1985. Was interviewed in the United States, and he talked about how the whole goal of most of the activity of KGB, I think he said 85%, was to undermine the stability, and that's of the United States. And evidently now the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is embarked upon the same thing. And why is that? United States, certainly back then, was the strongest nation in the world by far. And so how do you confront that stability. If you want to become the strongest nation, if you want to become the most powerful nation, or even get on an even level, how do you do that when the other country is just so strong, like the United States? Well, uh, speaking of being smart, the Russians, the KGB specifically, because Russians are good people. I'm just talking about, again, of course, the government leaders, but the KGB and also the CCP recognized that the way to get on a par with the United States, particularly in this nuclear age, strength is over the top in all countries. But how do you compromise that? How do you overcome that? How do you get on an even playing field? Undermine the stability of the nation. And this KGB guy, and if you go to YouTube, you can just look up KGB agent in YouTube in 1985, and it comes right up. In fact, a lot comes up about him. And if you go to the notes to this podcast, you'll see his name, and you can Google that too if you want to look him up. What's his name? Yuri Bezmenov, Bezmenov. It's worth looking into because they really talked about how they, crept their way into the academic and then the business, and how they went about, and then ultimately, there's a quote by Vladimir Lenin in there about something to the effect that, if we can just control the children, if we can take over the education system,
Well,
then
Michael,
we can take over the country. Yes, Scotty.
one of the interesting things that I was just thinking while you were doing that, and I don't know if I'm crazy from earlier, but it's like, why wouldn't they figure out, okay, like I was thinking about whenever I've not been as good as somebody else at something, I always looked at what they did and tried to emulate what they did or figure out what was wrong with me that I needed to kind of shore up so that I could get as good as them. It wasn't about trying to tear them down. It's how do I get
It's a
better?
good point. Build
And,
yourself up instead of tearing other people down. That's a basic principle we talk about on an individual level as well, don't we? But
and then and,
here's the thing: when it came to China, and also when it comes to Russia, number one, they don't have the natural resources that the United States does, and that makes the United States, in and of itself, a very powerful nation. Number two, the U.S. was building that up for a couple hundred years, while Russia had their revolution, China, the Boxer Rebellion, and all the kind of problems that they had, and Chairman Mao and all that. And so you're right. From early on, not only did they not have the natural resources, but they also took a wrong tack. And it's just been relatively recently, say in the post World War II, that they started taking a look at it and said, we've got to go about it another way. And they did it quite systematically, which is why this interview with this KGB
yeah.
defector is so interesting.
Well, here's another kind of interesting thing, Michael. I was playing with, I don't know if you've heard of Chat GPT.
No.
It's that new AI bot that you can put in and it can write a paper for you. It can write code for you. It's like a
Yeah.
supercomputer that does
Yeah,
everything.
I know
So
what you're talking about. Right.
so now I put in last night, I said, what's the best economic system to put in so that, you know, everybody thrives, you know,
What did
you know
it
that
say?
that kind of thing. He's like, well, if you look at the most powerful nations in the world,
That's
they
right.
use a combination. Like take the United States. It uses capitalism, some socialism, because it has government programs, everything. But each economy is going to be unique unto itself. It said you can't just use one economy for everything because every place has different like you were talking about. China doesn't have this resources, so it has to use certain economic things, that to its
Yeah, there's a
advantage.
degree of truth to that.
Yeah,
And I agree with it. At the same time, um, and this gets into other things I was going to talk about in this podcast anyway, but the idea that uh, what strength comes from stability. What's the stability of a nation? It's in the grassroots, it's in the earth, it's in the roots of the society, it's in the people in that regard. And so, any economic system that's really going to thrive long term, I mean, you can use strength and overpower the culture, like in early Marxist Lenin sort of communism that uh, kind of tried to suppress the people and control the people, and it just doesn't really work because you have to do something that's consistent with the people, and the people spontaneously just naturally have a self-interest, and so an economic system that will prosper is one that incentivizes the people, and the trouble with communism is it didn't. Even socialism, it's too undermining. So in the United States, and so what we're talking about here is fundamentally a capitalistic approach, but it most definitely and most obviously has to be bridled with some sort of controls, limitations, and you could call that a socialistic component if you want. I don't care. Uh, but it's just like, back in the Industrial Revolution when they were putting children on treadmill 12 hours a day and just feeding them sugar. I mean, obviously, the government has to step in. Slavery, another example.
It's
Uh,
funny, but like when you were talking about the socialist thing just now, it's like
mm,
it's funny how like when I was saying it to you earlier, I was like, God, this feels weird saying that. It doesn't feel that good saying that word because of the connotations that are associated with that word, socialism. You know what I
yeah.
mean? It's just it's interesting.
Yeah, well, the problem with a lot of forms of government, including now in the United States, is that if it gets top heavy with the government, uh, uh, then that starts to inflame, and a little bit of power, they get a taste and they want more, so the whole thing becomes messed up, and that's what we're really facing with today. The central government's just gotten too powerful,
Well,
and
so that reminds me of another thing, Michael, because it's kind of like all these things. It's the people that are the problem. It's not the thing that's the problem. It's how it's being implemented or
well, see,
how
that's
any.
it's interesting too, because how what is it about the people? Well, the people basically were played, and again, the CCP and the KGB approached that in the United States over the past really 70 years or so, quite brilliantly. They infiltrated gradually. They overtook the academic institutions and like that. And the way they did it was very interesting. And I talked about it a little bit in a previous podcast, but it's called the counterintuitive mentality. And because if you really take a look at a lot of these ivory tower notions about life and right and wrong, uh, it gets so convoluted that it ceases to be rational anymore. But what really happened is gradually what happened is it became the idea that if your logic was counterintuitive enough, in other words, if it didn't make sense, if it wasn't consistent with the deepest, and I mean deepest gut feelings, most refined gut feelings, uh, then it became this field of abstraction that was, difficult to follow, but complex and convoluted. And what happened then is the mentality that took over was kind of like the more convoluted and complex the mentality, if you could follow it, if you could make a sense of it, you can justify anything with the intellect, and people do, obviously. But if you can follow it, then you're not convoluted, you're not counterintuitive, you're smart. And so it became this whole thing where the whole counterintuitive culture had this weird rationale behind it. Uh, and if people aligned with it, then they were progressive, they were fashionable, they were ahead of their time. And so it fed on itself, and everybody wants to be smart. Everybody wants to, you know, be fashionable, if you will. And so it just became, they all jumped on the bandwagon. Uh, uh, but but fundamentally, Alexander the Great when he went and took over all these different countries, what he did was after he conquered a nation or a kingdom or what have you, he put the tribal leaders, he put the people of that land in charge. He didn't enslave them or imprison them. He empowered them in a way now, though, that made them part of his greater scheme of things. And it worked. Why? Because they were part of the grassroots. They had a fundamental, intuitive felt sense and intuitive nature of that culture and what worked for that culture, which is what you were talking about, Scotty. It's not one form of economic structure that's right for all nations, but nevertheless, there are fundamental principles such as, the natural tendency to, look out for yourself, to want a better life. And so the system has to be structured in a way where that's incentivized, that's honored, that's supported. And what happened is that kind of ceased to be the case, didn't it? I mean, right now, so much of what's going on in the United States undermines the economic system, and particularly because we have a certain global status quo here. One example is the monetary system. Everything in the world is really based on the US dollar. That's why, if you want to trade, I don't care what country you're in, if you want to trade, you got to have US dollars. And so if you're going to have a reserve currency, if you're going to have money in the bank, what form is it going to be in? US dollar. What does that mean? There's huge demand for the US dollar. What does that mean? We could print money like crazy, which is what we've been doing. And the value of the dollar stays up. Why? Because the demand for it is huge. But now what's happening is another thing. China now is starting to trade, I think, with Brazil in the Chinese currency. And you're seeing that sort of a thing happen all over the world. And if that really catches fire, if the dominant currency ceases to be the US dollar and becomes something else, you're going to see the economic system of the United States crumble. Because there's so much money out there that if the demand goes away, which it would, if it ceases to be the foundation, the dollar ceases to be the foundation of the economic system, then the dollar's going to become worthless. It's going to become worth less. Nobody's going to want it. So you're going to have all this money out there and nobody really wants it anymore. And that's part of what's in the works, is to undermine the stability. Because if you undermine the stability, there's no strength. And in this day and age, I mean, the Chinese know, the CCP knows, the Russians know, the KGB, everybody knows that in this day and age, nuclear war is off the table. There are bombs, and I forget, they're 800 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima, something like that. Hugely more powerful, and there are tons of them. Nuclear war would just turn the planet into a cinder, and everybody knows that. So they're going about these competitions that just arise throughout history, don't they, between nations? I mean, it just does. And right now, the good news is that they're all realizing that, and they're realizing it won't work. It has to be a different way, and so it's kind of a subversive undermining of the economic system, the stability. So the idea then in the Vedic tradition builds stability of every individual, of every nation, and then we all prosper and we all live in harmony, really. But it's the foundation of it is a stable base, a stable foundation, and for the human individual, that's about the transcendent. It's about being established in what? Your own being, your own sense of self, your own personal integrity. And it's called bala. It's called life force. And with respect to the mind, very interesting, because you have the intellect and then you have gut feeling, right? And even Maharishi Patanjali, I think I mentioned this in a podcast once, that one of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is transcendence and intuition But intuition translates in Sanskrit more accurately into gut feeling. It's the finest feeling level, though. It's not the barbaric, impulsive, animalistic, if you will, gut feeling, but it's the refined gut. And when you integrate that with the intellect, then you're integrating refined thought. You're integrating the whole physiology, the entirety of the mind. Because again, with the intellect, you can justify anything. But when it's connected to the soul and it's connected to the roots of life, to Mother Earth, that's when the intellect becomes a great tool. But without that, then the intellect becomes a lousy master. You can justify anything with it, and people do. This you mentioned artificial intelligence. So just briefly on that, Scotty, we're a little worried. Elon Musk has talked about how artificial intelligence could take over the world and machines could realize that they're smarter than people. And why do we need people? I mean, and that's the rationale, from Terminator movies and all. But here's one principle, is that one nation that's thirsty for control, maybe more than any other nation right now, is the CCP, the Chinese. And so if they start developing a technology, artificial intelligence, that has the potential to take things over and disempower all humans, they're going to be among the first to put a cap on it, So that's one component in this whole notion of artificial intelligence and how it could destroy the world that does need to be considered. And it's just one component, but I think it's something to think about. Do go to YouTube and you can find his name again. And it's worth watching. There's some short videos that are just what this Yuri KGB guy has to say in a nutshell. 14 minutes, I think one of them is, and then the whole interview is like over an hour. But at least looking at the short one is well worth your while, I think. Health is wholeness. Health is integration of the depth of our soul, the depth of our being, our gut feeling, our refined gut feeling with our mind, our intellect, how we function on a daily basis. Health is wholeness. And it's really interesting now. Speaking of universal principles, if you take that principle and apply it to the undermining of the stability of a nation, what you do then is you break down the integration. You polarize different groups. Now there's the whole transsexual culture, and it's almost like systematically it's creating a polarization. And then now the Christians are becoming polarized. People are kind of associating Christians with, really racist or bias or narrow-mindedness, which isn't true. But nevertheless, as with all cultures and all subgroups, there are some within every subgroup, including Christian, that do think that way. And so they're feeding that. So the more division, the more lack of integration within a culture, the more you undermine it. The less stable it becomes, the less strong it becomes. Strength is founded in stability, you see, stability of the culture. So it's really remarkable to see what was going on and how they went about it, and it's just so applicable to these principles. The whole approach to Vedic tradition, the evolution of people, is that which cultivates stability, inner stability, because real stability isn't cultivated by putting a cap on top of a society or on top of an individual, but it's about feeding and nourishing and blossoming that inner stability that's inherent in their own true nature, their own inner divinity, that finest feeling level, that finest level of gut feeling. Gut feeling is an intuitive felt sense that is harmony with nature. Because why? Because that's what we are from. That's what we are born of. That's what we are one with. And so to get back to economics, the economic system, an economic system that will flourish is one that's consistent with nature, Mother Nature, our own intuitive nature. and these ivory tower, ice cream cone in the sky notions of a society, 1984, the perfect society, you know, the book, whatever. That will never work. Oh, you can try it for a little while. You know, you have nations conquering other nations all the time, but give it 10, 20 years, whatever. What happens is the grassroots come up and it reverts back to what's inherent in that culture, what's inherent in the nature of those individuals, you see. So that's such an important principle. Whatever in life is going on, whatever you're up to, the number one key, the foundation is stability. And, you know, culturally, they talk all the time, sociologically, they talk all the time about the real seed of stability of the individual as they're growing up is the home, which is really interesting because what's going on in America now is that the educational system, they're talking about the parents, children don't belong to the parents, they belong to the state. And right away, you're starting to undermine that seed of stability in an individual. And there's plenty of statistical evidence that supports that. You know, a healthy home, a stable family is so fundamentally important, you know. Think about it. There's so many examples. And I think we can look at any issue that's up, even in the news, you know, gun control, COVID virus, how that was handled, anything. Think about it and view it from the perspective of, does this enhance the inner stability of the nation, or does it compromise it? And when a nation then, when the inner stability is compromised, it has no foundation, and so the strength is going to be fleeting at best. All right. Anything else, Scotty? I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, I think you got it.
All right. Thanks for listening, and we will talk with you again next week. You take care, and appreciate you being with us.